Sunday, 26th of August. We'd been invited for lunch by George and Vicky Johnson, who owned not only the gîte we were staying in, but also the beautiful house just behind it, in which they lived. George had bought the plot of land in 1997 for £30,000 and built both houses himself. Their own house was enormous, with a large and deep swimming pool to match. They had kindly invited us for lunch and for a swim in their pool during the day. Paul dived into the pool on arrival at the house, but I didn't. Knowing that we'd be drinking wine, I declined the invitation to swim. They were a warm and friendly couple. George, 55, had the looks of the toughest of the Mitchell brothers in EastEnders. He had some stories to relate about his darker side when he was younger. He was the sort of man you'd expect to punch any man who wolf-whistled at his wife. Vicky, 47, was pretty and curvy, quiet and feminine. She wore a bikini that showed off her figure to best effect, and I told George he was lucky to have such an attractive wife. He seemed flattered by the observation. Before long we downed a couple of bottles of excellent entre de mer and enjoyed a delicious lunch. And so the afternoon progressed, with everyone becoming more and more drunk, George and Paul taking turns to jump into the swimming pool, drenching Vicky and myself. How we all laughed. I asked George and Vicky the secret of their happy relationship, and George mischievously said it was having sex 2 or 3 times a day, an assertion which seemed to surprise Vicky. Then he added that there was a special reason why Vicky enjoyed sex so much, at which point she slapped him playfully and said forcefully, "Don't you dare tell him." George mentioned to Paul that he dived off the 3-metre-high wall near the pool in previous years. So, quelle surprise, Paul decided to repeat the feat himself, despite the fact that he'd consumed more wine than I'd ever seen him consume, and he'd admitted to being a bit wobbly. I was sensible enough to try and deter him, but he wouldn't listen, and duly dived off the wall. He did it with such ease that I asked him to do it again for a photograph, which he did as effortlessly as the first time. An hour or so later, as dusk was falling, Paul said he'd had enough to drink and returned to the gîte to sleep off the wine. An hour later it was dark, and George and I were now very drunk. I suddenly noticed a stunning young woman swimming elegantly up and down the pool, and asked George who it was. He said it was Vicky. The wine had transformed her into Maria Sharapova. Vicky exited the pool and sat on a chair. My inhibitions had been removed by the wine, and I decided to take off my clothes and started swimming in the nude. Had I been sober, I'm sure I had have asked permission first. I was in the pool, leaning on the side, when George came over and we had an interesting conversation. "Mike, would you like to have sex with my wife?" "Eh?" "Well, you obviously fancy Vicky. Would you like to have sex with her?" "What? Of course not, George." "Are you quite sure? I'm not a jealous man. And maybe she'd like a bit of variety. Seriously, would you like me to ask her if she'll have sex with you?" "Of course not, George. Don't." Now, it was true I'd found Vicky becoming more attractive with every glass of wine I'd consumed, and I was drunk, but surely not that drunk. My little remaining common sense told me this could end badly when George sobered up the next morning. I imagined returning home to the UK in an air ambulance. Did my insurance policy cover this sort of thing? I very much doubted it. Paul ambled over to the other side of the pool where Vicky was sitting. They conversed for perhaps 5 minutes, and George pointed at me a number of times. Then he returned. "My wife says thank you for the kind offer, but she doesn't want to have sex with you. She says she's sorry." "George, I can't believe you actually asked her." "No need to thank me," he said breezily. I judged this a prudent moment to return to our gîte and await my fate the next morning. The next morning, Monday the 27th of August, I was standing by our pool, nursing a major hangover, and memories of the previous night were starting to return. Paul had gone on one of his daily walks and wouldn't be back for some time. Then I recalled the final conversation of the previous night. I reflected that Paul, a martial arts expert, could have proved useful if George were to turn nasty. I was about to walk back quietly to the gîte and lie low until Paul's return, when George turned up at the gate. The gate was locked, but I was sure George could jump over it in a moment. So I had little choice but to wander over to the gate, and we started to chat. "George, what can I say? My sincere apologies to you and Vicky for my behaviour last night. It really isn't cricket to get so drunk when invited for a meal and drinks." "Eh?" he said. "No problem. We both had a great time and really enjoyed your company and Paul's." "Thanks," I said, "but I can't believe you asked Vicky if she'd have sex with me. She must have been mortified." He laughed and then said, "We were actually chatting about some modifications we want to make to the house, and I thought if I pointed at you a few times, you'd believe we were having a different conversation. We do the same thing with everyone who rents the gîte."